The inherent prejudice of SCOTUS's shadow docket. Welcome to Law and Society. Please subscribe. And let's talk about how SCOTUS is also playing the leopard won't eat my face game. In light of Trump versus Orr, it must be said that darkness looms in the halls of the Supreme Court. The court's majority has a reckless disregard for the well-being of transgender people. But transgender rights are human rights, no matter what message the Supreme Court wants to send with its unexplained and inequitable ruling in Trump v. Orr. If a case is likely to succeed on the merits, in SCOTUS's inequitable shadow docket rulings, just saying that at the pretrial stage and allowing the executive to continue policies that are illegal, unconstitutional, and inequitable creates an inherent prejudice that cannot be cured with the most sacrosanct trial procedure. SCOTUS has already said that the government is likely to succeed on the merits, thereby allowing it to continue operation that reasonable people would consider both unconstitutional and illegal. Like with the ICE procedures, where people's constitutional rights to due process, unreasonable seizure, right to counsel, and right not to be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment are all trampled on by ICE with the help of Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence in Nome v. Perdomo, or transgender rights like in Trump v. Orr, where the court does not even consider the harm caused to transgender people and the burden plaintiffs have to bear by allowing Trump to change U.S. passport policy to only include sex that was the person's sex at the time of birth, or firing Senate-confirmed nominees of independent agencies, removal of such people required by law, POTUS, to notify Congress a month before the dismissal, and that dismissal must be for cause. And as a side, the only reason SCOTUS would allow Donald to fire these nominees would be to send the message that this court is completely okay with a unitary executive who has the power to fire all executive branch employees, however independent. Kind of defeats the purpose of having independent agencies. But who really cares about that, right? Or let's talk about the dozens of other recent cases where SCOTUS has granted Trump equitable relief when the court could just as easily ruled in favor of plaintiffs who showed numerous instances of irreparable injury and monetary, emotional, as well as constitutional harm. But the court sided with the government's equitable harm and did not even consider the other sides. It particularly stings in Trump v. Orr, perhaps because trans people are part of my community, the LGBTQ plus community, and SCOTUS doesn't even discuss the hardship transgender people would endure if they were subjected to discrimination based on their sexual identity. It also gives a hint that the court really does not consider hardships endured by transgender people as hardships at all, or at least not hardships that rise to the level that would require SCOTUS to grant them any rights whatsoever, not even a basic reasonable basis protection that all protected classes are afforded, which is that the state can enact laws that are rationally related to a legitimate state interest. It's hard to see what the legitimate state interest would be of subjecting transgender people to state-mandated sex identity reassignment when they have spent their entire lives to reassign themselves to the gender to which their psyches conform. Forcing such a state mandate only goes to harass and demean a historically marginalized group of people who should be very much be afforded strict scrutiny protection, where the state has to give a compelling interest to implement a law that is narrowly tailored to achieve that state interest. Again, I don't see what narrowly tailored state interest there could be for them to impose such a directive by the executive. And here, there is no compelling state interest. What makes this even worse is that SCOTUS is ruling in this regime's favor on actions the government takes by following Donald Trump's executive orders and the law, at least in some instances. In instances where Donald uses a law, like in the case of National Guard deployment and tariffs, those cases are currently pending in courts across the country. But the cases where the executive actions are based purely on an executive order, SCOTUS has no obligation to give that executive order the weight of law. In fact, doing so undermines the rule of law and constitutional protections provided by the Fifth Amendment process of Fifth Amendment right to equal protection under the law. It is unbecoming of SCOTUS to side with a president who endanger constitutional rights and protections through executive orders, thereby giving the executive and the legislative branch a hint as to what direction it may go were they to legislate in that regard. There's no anti-trans legislation in our government so far, but by executive commanding to change passport issuance policy to become anti-trans by executive order, and by then having SCOTUS rubber stamp it, the regime seems to be teeing up to introduce anti-trans legislation in Congress and pass it into law. So what's the point of fact-finding by the courts? What's the point of district courts and the due process of law? What's the point of seeking remedy in courts when the highest court in the land refuses to be equitable? Steve Vladeck and Justice Jackson quite elaborately describe the nature of equity in our legal system. I've put Mr. Vladeck's piece and Justice Jackson's dissent in the description box of this video. Please read them to better understand why and how the shadow docket procedural trick is creating an unequal playing field with a heavy lean towards favoring an ever-expanding executive branch. They describe it granularly. How the court assesses that an all-powerful executive will benefit the court's position and power is anybody's guess. From afar, it doesn't look good for the court's future. An absolutist presidency with an acquiescent Congress could quite easily gut the judiciary. After all, the Constitution only talks about the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice. The rest of the judiciary is created through congressional legislation that presidents then signed into law. If Donald Trump is able to skew the midterm elections by getting enough Republican governors to carve out mid-decade redistricting plans, MAGA Republicans could very likely hold power or get into power because the regime picked the voters instead of the other way around, which it is supposed to be. Should that happen, Donald can incrementally eat away at the rule of law with SCOTUS's help. Add to that, if Republican Senate leaders bow to Donald and end the filibuster, there's very little anybody can do to stop Donald Trump from directing a compliant Congress to pass unconstitutional disparate laws that would be rubber stamped by the Supreme Court, which would remain in place as the highest ceremonial rubber stamping institution in America. Like in a constitutional monarchy, you have the monarch, or in constitutional republics, you have the president as being the ceremonial head. Except in France, where the president really has more powers than the prime minister. That's different. Of course, there's a lot of ifs that go behind this scenario. But consider this. Getting Donald back for a second term was also a big if until it happened. Donald's executive orders and his police state were all distant ifs until they became reality. And the way SCOTUS is empowering POTUS does not bode well for our republic, the Constitution, our rights, and the rule of law. Also, a reminder, there's another case which alleges U.S. military discrimination because of Pete Hegseth's trans ban on the military. I provided my talk on that issue in the description box with the title Discrimination and Disruption. Please check it out. So at this time of hardship, please defend the rights of those who are marginalized. Please help those who need food assistance. You can check out the description box under resources to find food pantries you can help or be helped by. If you have any resources that can help others, please leave that in the comment box and I'll add it to my list. Help get the word out on what's happening in our government and the chaos that is headed our way. Be engaged, remain vigilant, and thank you all for listening. Take care.